Chapter 25 Fascinations, Invisibility, Levitation, Transmutations, and Kinks in Time. Karasorer, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Dear me, dear me. The world's indeed gone topsy-turvy if you have to ask me for the secrets of fascination. Altogether toho boho and the timura tash rack. So much for a display of old world courtly manners. Actually rubbish. For you might very well be fascinating without knowing how you work the trick. In fact, I think that is the case 99 times in 100. Besides, I read your letter carelessly. I overlooked the phrase in which you mentioned that you used the word as Levi did. Example, to cover all those types of miracle which depend on distracting the attention of, or otherwise composing, the miracle-y. I invent a rather useful word, yes? So let us see what sort of miracles those are. To start with, I doubt if we can. Many of such thaumaturgic phenomena contain elements of illusion in greater or lesser degree. If the miracle-y's mind is 100% responsible, I think the business becomes a mere conjuring trick. My dictionary defines the verb, quote, to charm, to enchant, to act on by some irresistible influence, to captivate, to excite and allure irresistibly or powerfully, end quote. For the noun, it gets even deeper on technical magic. Quote, the act or power of fascinating or spellbinding, often to one's harm, a mysterious, irresistible, alluring influence. End quote. Personally, I have always used or heard it much less seriously. Attractive, hardly more. Skeet, surprisingly, is almost dumb. Of to enchant and from el fascinum, a spell. Yes, surprisingly, for the word is one of the many that means the phallus. The implication is that there is some sexual element in the exciting and alluring quality, which lifts it altogether above mere pleasing. To my mind, the implication is that there is some quality inherent which is cognate to that too totally irrational quasi magnetic force which has been responsible not only for innumerable personal tragedies and comedies, but for the fall of dynasties and even the wreck of empires. Christ is reported as having said, quote, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto me. End quote. Interpret this in the light of the cross as a phallic emblem, and how lurid a flash. Compare Al, chapter 2, verse 26, quote, I am the secret serpent coiled about to spring. In my coiling there is joy. If I lift up my head, I and my nui are one. If I droop down my head and shoot forth venom, then is rapture of the earth, and I and the earth are one. End quote. This versicle is deep, devilishly deep, and it is chock-a-block with the mysteries of fascination. Dig into this, dear sister. Dig with your Kabbalistic trowel. Don't blame me if you don't get a mandrake with the very first thrust. But most certainly I shall say nothing here. Yes, indeed, nothing was ever more sternly forbidden than prattle on subjects like this. Look, it goes right on. Quote, there is a great danger in me, for who doth not understand these runes shall make a great miss. He shall fall down into the pit called because, and there he shall perish with the dogs of reason. End quote. Verse 27. The pit is, of course, the abyss. See the book The Vision in the Voice, 10th Aether. A very sticky, or rather unstuck, finish. To business. Fascination. No. Invisibility is obviously penny plain, estade. This is notably an affair of the subconscious. It often masters open dislike and distaste. It never yields to reason. It destroys all sense of values. Its origin is usually obscure. The least irrational base of it is the sense of smell. It was, if I remember rightly, the Comte de Saint Germain who advised Louis de Valois to fix her exquisitely broidered handkerchief in such wise that it protected her from contact with her saddle, and then, after a morning's hard gallop, to find an excuse for using it to wipe the brows of the perspiring king. It took him years to recover. The story is well known, and the plan widely adopted with remarkably unvarying success. But be careful not to overdo it, for if the source of the perfume is recognized, the consciousness takes charge, and the result is antipathy. Many years ago, I composed a scent based on similar principles, which I intended to market under the title Potted Sex Appeal. We tried it out with the assistance of a certain noble marquess, whose consequent misadventures won't he laugh when he reads this? But there are other senses. L'amour de Laurie may refer not only to Othello's way of snaring Desdemona, but subtleties of timbre in the voice. Yes, yes, you say impatiently, but there isn't any miracle about all this in the ordinary sense of the word. True, but why the devil do you want me, so long as you're getting what you need? Just being childlike, I suppose, no? Merely that you can explain such matters to yourself well enough. All right, on to number two. Shall we look at levitation for a change? This power, if it be one, is very curious indeed. It connects more directly with magnetism than almost any other. The first thing we think of when someone says magnet is picking up iron filings as a child. Age before honesty. Let Father Pujan S.J. speak first. He is obliged to admit the phenomenon because the church has done so. But precisely similar accounts of levitation of pagans and heretics must be, according to him, lies or works of the devil. As for the method, quote, God employs the angels to raise the saint so as to avoid the necessity of intervening himself. End quote. Lazy old parishioner. Now for a douche of common sense. Hatha yoga is quite clear and simple, even logical about it. The method is plain pranayama. Didn't I tell you one time of the four stages of success? Perspiration, of a very special kind. Sukshma kumbhakam, automatic rigidity. One stiffens like a dog in a bell jar when you pump in carbon dioxide, is it? The Bachari city, jumping about like a frog. One is wafted, without one's asana being disturbed, about the floor, rather as fragments of paper or dry leaves might be in the slight draught under the door. If one is quite perfectly balanced, one cannot be moved sideways. So one rises, and there you are. Personally, I reached the Bushari city quite a number of times, but I never observed number four. On several occasions, other people have seen me levitated, though never to a height of more than a foot or so. Here is the best account of such an incident, of those at my immediate disposal. Quote, nearly midnight. At this moment, we stopped dictating and began to converse. Then Frater P said, oh, if I could only dictate a book like the Tao Te King. Then he closed his eyes as if meditating. Just before I had noticed a change in his face, most extraordinary, as if he were no longer the same person. In fact, in the 10 minutes we were talking, he seemed to be any number of different people. I especially noticed the pupils of his eyes were so enlarged that the entire eye seemed black. I tremble so and have such a quaking feeling inside, simply in thinking of that night, that I can't form letters. Then, quite slowly, the entire room filled with a thick yellow light, deep golden, but not brilliant. I mean, not dazzling, but soft. Frater P looked like a person I had never seen but seemed to know quite well. His face, clothes, and all were the same yellow. I was so disturbed that I looked up to the ceiling to see what caused the light, but could only see the candles. Then the chair on which he sat seemed to rise. It was like a throne, and he seemed to be either dead or sleeping, but it was certainly no longer Frater P. This frightened me, and I tried to understand by looking around the room. When I looked back, the chair was raised, and he was still the same. I realized I was alone, and thinking he was dead or gone or some other terrible thing, I lost consciousness. End quote. This discourse has been thus left unfinished, but it is only necessary to add that the capacity to extract such spiritual honey from these unpromising flowers is the mark of an adept who has perfected his magic cup. This method of Kabbalistic exegesis is one of the best ways of exalting the reason to the higher consciousness. Evidently, it started Frater P, so that in a moment he became completely concentrated and entranced. Note that this has nothing at all to do with pranayama. It seems a matter of ecstatic concentration, which chose this mode of expression instead of bringing on samadhi, though that, too, occurred in some of the cases. By the way, here is a fairly full account of the whole business. I have just remembered. It is in my autohagiography. Quote, pranayama produce, firstly, a peculiar kind of perspiration. Secondly, an automatic rigidity of the muscles. And thirdly, the very curious phenomenon of causing the body, while still absolutely rigid, to take little hops in various directions. It seems as if one were somehow raised, possibly an inch from the ground, and deposited very gently a short distance away. I saw a very striking case of this at Candy. When Alan was meditating, it was my duty to bring his food very quietly from time to time into the room adjoining that where he was working. One day he missed 2 meals in a row, and I thought I ought to look into his room to see if all was well. I must explain that I have known only 2 European women and 3 European men who could sit in the attitude called Padmasana, which is that usually seen in seated images of the Buddha. Of these men, Alan was one. He could knot his legs so well that, putting his hands on the ground, he could swing his body to and fro in the air between them. When I looked into his room, I found him not seated on his meditation mat, which was in the center of the room at the end farthest from the window, but in a distant corner, 10 or 12 feet off, still in his knotted position, resting on his head and right shoulder, exactly like an image overturned. I set him right way up, and he came out of his trance. He was quite unconscious that anything unusual had happened, but he had evidently been thrown there by the mysterious forces generated by pranayama. There is no doubt whatever about this phenomenon. It is quite common. But the yogis claim that the lateral motion is due to a lack of balance, and that if one were in perfect spiritual equilibrium, one would rise directly in the air. I have never seen any case of levitation, and hesitate to say that it has happened to me, though I have actually been seen by others on several occasions, apparently poised in the air. For the first 3 phenomena, I have found no difficulty in devising quite simple physiological explanations, but I can form no theory as to how the practice could counteract the force of gravitation, and I am unregenerate enough to allow this to make me skeptical about the occurrence of levitation. Yet, after all, the stars are suspended in space. There is no a priori reason why the forces which prevent them rushing together should not come into operation in respect of the earth and the body. End quote. The Allen part of this is the best evidence at my disposal. He could not have got where he did by hopping, and he couldn't have gotten to that position intentionally. He must have been levitated, lost balance, and dropped upside down. In any case, there is no trace of fascination about it, as there may have been in Sora Vericum's observation. About invisibility now. Of this, I have so much experience that the merest outline would take us far beyond the limits of a letter. In Mexico, I worked at acquiring the power by means of ritual. I worked desperately hard. I got to a point where my image in a pier glass flickered, rather like the very earliest films did. Possibly more work, after more skill had come to me, might have done the whole trick. But I did not persist when I found out how to do it by fascination. Here we are at last. Roughly, this is how to do it. If one is concentrated to the point when what you are thinking of is the only reality in the universe, when you lose all awareness of who and where you are and what you are doing, it seems as though that unconsciousness were in some way contagious. The people around you just can't see anybody. At one time in Sicily, this happened nearly every day. Our party, strolling down to our bathing bay, the loveliest spot of its kind that I have ever seen, over a hillside where there wasn't cover for a rabbit, would lose sight of me, look, and fail to find me, though I was walking in their midst. At first, astonishment, bewilderment. At last, so normal had it become, quote, he's invisible again, end quote. One incident I remember very vividly indeed. An old friend and I were sitting opposite each other in armchairs in front of a large fire, smoking our pipes. Suddenly, he lost sight of me and actually cried out in alarm. I said, "What's wrong?" That broke the spell. There I was, all present and correct. Did I hear you mutter transmutations? Werewolves? Golden hawks? Likely enough, it's time we touched on that. In certain types of animal, there appears, if tradition has any weight, to be a curious quality of sympathy. I doubt if that be the word, that can think of none better, which enables them to assume at times the human form. Number one, and the rest are also Rand's, is the seal. There is a whole body of literature about this. Then come wolves, hyenas, large dogs of the hunting type, occasionally leopards. Tales of cats and serpents are usually the other way around. It is the human, nearly always female, that assumes these shapes by witchcraft. But in ancient Egypt, they literally doted on this sort of thing. The papyri are full of formulas for operating such transmutations. But I think that this was mostly to afford some relaxation for the spirit of the dead man. He nipped out of his sarcophagus and painted the town all the colors of the rainbow in one animal shape or another. The only experience I have of anything of the sort was when I was in Pacific waters, mostly at Honolulu or in Nippon. I was practicing astral projection. A sister of the order who lived in Hong Kong helped me. I was to visit her, and the token of perfect success was to be that I should knock a vase off the mantelpiece. We appointed certain days and hours, with some awkwardness, as my time distance from her was constantly growing shorter, for me to pay my visit. We got some remarkable results. Our records of the interview used to tally with surprising accuracy, but the vase remained intact. This is not one of my notorious digressions, and this is how transmutation comes into it. I found that by first taking the shape of a golden hawk and resuming my own form after landing in her temple, a room she had fitted ad hoc, the whole operation became incomparably easier. I shall not indulge in hypothesis of why this should have been the case. A little over 4 years later, in the meantime, we had met and worked at Magic together. We resumed these experiments in a somewhat different form. The success was much greater, but though I could move her and even any objects which she was touching, I could make no impression on inanimate objects at a distance from her. The behavior of her dogs and of her cat was very curious and interesting. Strangest of all, there appeared those kinks in time, which profane science is just beginning to discuss. Example: on one occasion, our records of an interview agree with quite extraordinary precision. But, on comparing notes, it was found that owing to some stupid miscalculation of mine, it was all over in Hong Kong some hours before I had started from Honolulu. Again, don't ask me why or how or anything. In the summer of 1910, I was living at 125 Victoria Street, in a studio converted into a temple by means of a circle, an altar, and the rest. West of the altar was a big fireplace with the fenders set. The east wall was covered with bookshelves. Enter the late Theodore Russ, O.H.O., in Freighter Superior of the O.T.O. He wanted me to join that order. I recommended him in politer language to repeat the Novocastrian experiment. Undeterred, he insisted, "But you must." Now we go back or forward, I know not which, to a night when I found myself stranded in London. I asked hospitality of a stranger. It was readily afforded. Some hours later, my hostess fell asleep. I could not do so. Something was nagging me. I suddenly took my notebook and wrote a certain passage in a certain book, since published. "Must, my foot," he persisted. "You have published the secret of the nth degree of the O.T.O., and you must take the corresponding oaths." "I have done nothing of the sort. I don't know the secret. I don't want to know it. I don't." He interrupted me. He strode across the room. He plucked a book from the shelves, opened it. He thrust it under my nose. He pointed out a passage with an index. I began to stammer. "Yes, I wrote that. I don't know what it means. I don't like it. I only put it in because it was written in rather curious circumstances, and I was too lazy, or perhaps a little afraid, to reject it and write what I wanted." He concentrated on one point. "You don't know what it means?" I repeated that I did not, even now that he had claimed it as important. He explained it to me as to a child. I was merely surprised. It didn't sound possible. "Sister, all this while I've been lying to you like an archbishop. It is connected with fascinations. Indeed, it has very little to do with anything else." Finally, he won me over. I went down to his G.H.Q, took the oaths, was installed in the throne of the 10th degree of the O.T.O. as National Sovereign Grand Master General, and began to establish the order as a going concern. Well, you say, that is a very simple story, nothing specially hard to believe in it. True, but consider the dates. That scene in Victoria Street is as clear and vivid in my mind, in every detail, as if it were yesterday. That secret is published only in that passage of that book, and the book was not published until 3 years later, and from an address of which in 1910 I had not so much as thought of. The date of my adhesion to the O.T.O., which, by the way, upset every principle and plan that I had ever held, is equally certain by virtue of subsequent published writings. Now go away and explain that. Well, I've given you a fair account of some of the principal fascinations. As to the rest, bewitchments, sorceries, inhibitions, and all that lot, it is enough if I say that they follow the regular laws of magic. In some, fascinations proper plays a prominent part. In others, it is barely more than walking on to say, "My lord, the carriage waits." But even that can be done well or ill, and a small mistake may work a mighty mischief. Love is the law. Love under will. Yours fraternally.